this constant moment of 3 a.m. Importantly, this project also produced a kind of opening, as 1 hour of silence was recorded in the process of mapping the world through house music, which anticipated by this poster as the subject of a work I'm currently developing. But through both this formal and conceptual insistence within the exhibition, there was, I like to think, a kind of synergy created in the relation between these works. This may be thought in the way that each work unfolds the other, creating new entries or openings. That the 3 a.m. work may be thought to play the world like a record finds an odd manifestation in both the runway footage, which appears at times formally like a spinning record, and the records, which seem in their own complicated history and instability to allegorize a relationship to the spinning earth imagined in both the runway footage and the 3 a.m. O'Connell project. The stillness found in motion, which is desired in the runway project, appears to find an equivalence in the 3 a.m. O'Connell work, which produces a related stillness in the way it follows a constant moment around the surface of the earth. What this produces in the encounter is a kind of play between each work, which seems to allow each work to complicate and intensify the other, in which one suspended moment is answered by another, one process of unfolding or opening met with another. So these synergies, I like to think, returning to the idea of the sculptural form as an optical device, sort of, in my thinking, work to produce these kind of imagined images, which for me arise in this play between the forms. So images which would not otherwise appear. We may think of these images as a kind of uncontained image, as they seem to overflow the bounds of any single articulation and are rather produced in the relationship between things. This type of image I relate to the unstable image in the imagining that Manzoni's plinth produces in its own relationship to the earth. Images which in their own way offer a disorganizing glimpse of other ways of encountering the world. So I've quite genuinely begun to imagine these kinds of glimpses in the way they suggest different ways of being, as intimations of another world. As to recognize the world otherwise necessitates too, I believe, a very real shift in one's own footing and sense of gravity. To ask the viewer to turn away from their desire for meaning, to surrender momentarily their determining faculty, as it were, is also to ask them to turn away from the tireless effort to give meaning to themselves, deciding rather in that moment to put their own constitution as subjects radically into question, surrendering their prospect position and the thinking of a privileged perspective. So this is, of course, the charge of the Manzoni work, to play with and trouble these ways of seeing, playing with those forces that bring us into contact with the earth, both physically and through the imaginary. So what draws these works together for me is not only their formal and conceptual echoes, but also in each case a resistance to closure. So this is a resistance to being easily determined or resolved. And this resistance to closure is not to privilege ambiguity, but rather to allow a kind of play between works. As within this space of play, I believe it's where these glimpses or images arise. So rather than ambiguity, or rather than simply ambiguity perhaps, this kind of encounter, I believe, may create a meaningful experience that is at the same time animated by a resistance to a closure of meaning. What this also points to is the possibility of producing openings in what initially may have appeared closed or given. So to contest the stability of the image, which in this context I identify with the conditions of the factory, the clock, and in a related way, the coffee mug. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I'm wondering if anybody has a question for Jamie. Yeah, please, we've got some time.
Can you tell us more about what the 1 hour silence show would be?
The 1 hour silence show? So it's sort of a very obliquely developed thing at the moment, and I think it will take various iterations. But the thinking currently has been to try and find, again, the thinking through this idea of equivalences, has been to try and find an equivalent sort of silence to answer that silence in a way. And what that's led to is engaging with the band Happy Mondays, who are particular in the sort of landscape of this history, and that they became massive in 1989, which is, the same moment that 3 a.m. O'Connell was distributed and broadcast, but it's also this very particular moment in the history of house music and rave in the UK. I don't know if you know the history of it particularly, but there's this, they had these unusually hot summers through 88, 89, which sort of led to this outpouring of sort of energy, particularly, under Thatcher, that all these illegal raves are basically set up across the UK. And during that moment is when you get these bands like the KLF and Happy Mondays arise. But what's particular about Happy Mondays is that they have a fully fledged band member who doesn't play an instrument. So it's this guy called Bez, and all he does is dance. So he's on all their albums, he's present, in all their studio recordings, but he's just kind of this silent presence on the albums. So what I've done is basically engaged Bez to restage a video that they shot live on television in 1989 on a broadcast, The Other Side of Midnight, which was Tony Wilson of Factory Records would run this program, which would put these bands on and they'd play. So we've restaged an appearance on TV from 1989, but purely with Bez. So the performance that they did was a song called Performance. So, this is why it's at the bottom of this poster, it's got this silent performance, because as a restaging, it just becomes this silent dance video of Bez just dancing. And what I think is particular about that is, and particular about Bez as a sort of figure, is the way that him being in that position does this really nice sort of leveling thing of taking, this difference between the dance floor and the stage and kind of leveling it out, bringing the stage up to the same level as the dance floor, or the dance floor up to the same level as the stage, rather. Yeah, so sort of working with that equivalence to actually set up this video work, which currently is going to be notionally sort of soundtracked by the 3AM Eternal work in a way. It's still sort of assembling that.
Yamasato, please.
Thanks, Jamie. Just kind of maybe I wanted to ask you a question, which is probably more like a statement.
Yeah.
I'm curious about this kind of curious collision between, I guess, maybe kind of pop cultural references, in this case, maybe kind of popular music, and also something that's not so popular in the art world, perhaps of the trope of conceptual art. Maybe how those two kind of curious collisions operate in your work, but maybe how you come to identify that.
Can you expand on what your collision between pop art, or this sort of, pop aesthetic and conceptual art?
Maybe like thinking about references to Beyonce or kind of Happy Mondays or kind of KLF. I guess it's kind of like references to kind of popular culture and music.
Yep.
Which is maybe something inherent in popular culture that non-art world people would identify, but then I guess maybe tropes of presentation, which to my mind maybe kind of echo kind of conceptual art. It's a production where it's almost like you're documenting the documentation of these kind of maybe hybrid collapses of popular culture and maybe kind of.
Are you asking me to talk about the reason for doing that, or more the form? A big part of that goes back to kind of images like that, the Whole Earth image, and also that Beyonce coffee mug, in the way that they often become these very reduced and sort of iconic things, which is, there's something very prevalent in that sort of the sort of pop culture sort of image saturation. They become these very reduced images, but then to sort of like enter into those and kind of make an argument for complexity within them, I guess. So, it becomes a way of sort of entering into these things that I live with and around and am engaged with, but try to sort of reintroduce and trouble those images and sort of reintroduce this and sort of make an argument for complexity in relation to those images. So it's not, with that Whole Earth image, it's like, it did become, and the same thing can be said of the Beyonce mug, like it is a sort of a powerful symbol and an empowering symbol in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it becomes, there's also these more nefarious sort of undercurrents that are present in them. So it's kind of like this sort of duck-rabbit thing, where the image can be seen in various ways. So I guess quite often, what I'm playing with is this way to sort of open images up in that way. And the way that sort of the image sort of becomes the image and also the way of seeing the image sort of almost becomes analogous to the self and the way of seeing the self. Because, a lot of the times we identify really strongly with these things. And once you start to sort of destabilize those things in a way, it makes an argument that I like to think sort of occupies an area that's not, I mean, although my work is like bizarrely rational and like everything I worked in this talk was sort of bizarrely heavy and rational for like this, sort of audience. It's kind of how I operate. But I think when it works right, the argument doesn't happen on a rational level, and it rather encounters like the level of appetite or the level of sort of balance, and it starts to, the argument's sort of staged in a process of vertigo rather than a rational debate, if that makes sense. So I think that's how those two things sort of mesh. It's trying to take those things that we love and we're comfortable with and sort of just intensify them in various ways. I mean, some of the things, like the 3 a.m. O'Connell work sort of wholly, jumps into this sort of, optimism and affirmation that surrounds the idea of house music, like house music sort of arising out of the gay and civil rights movements in the UK. Like it had this mantra that, people that live together or people that dance together can live together. And so, I mean, this sort of embellishment of that to like somehow take the entire world and turn it into a dance floor, like sort of, I mean, I'm trying to like turn up the volume on that message in a way. So there's times when I really buy into those mantras, but then also like try to introduce the complexity back into them in a way. Like, I mean, using Bez as this sort of counterpoint symbol to that. He's like this aging white guy who sort of presents this sort of complex counterpoint in the way that he also sort of embodies that like moment in a way, but embodies it in a way that's sort of, I don't know, like uncomfortable in our sort of contemporary moment, I'd say. I don't know if that answers your question at all. Does it go close? Not even close? Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, it's sort of like, it's very much part of my practice to sort of, I don't know, I sort of owe a lot to that sort of European tradition of like conceptual art, and a lot of my stuff's invested in that, but then I sort of, I don't know, it just sort of becomes a strange hybrid just through, I don't know, just my own life experiences and, just the encounter with, these forms, and then just trying to find my own way to assemble, what my encounter with those, are. I don't think I answered your question.
No, but it was really good.
Cool.
Look, it's come to the end of the session. Please join me in thanking Jamie for really great generosity.
Thanks.
And wishing you all a great break, and we'll see you back on, hang on today, what date is it? Oh, here's Kay. Kay's going to be the next speaker. So Thursday the 2nd of May. We'll see you then. Thank you.